But yeah, all right. Thanks, Ed. Demian, thanks all for joining.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Josh. I'm a bit nervous, actually. This is quite intimidating. So we had a call, the Universal Viewer Dev call a couple of weeks ago. And what's been going on with the UV recently is the steering group, the Open Collective, has paid for some work to kind of upgrade the UVC's Webpack. And now that we've got Webpack, we're kind of starting to think about how can we rework the kind of components that are in the UV at the moment, most of which use jQuery, you know, go all the way back to kind of 2013 sort of time. And they still work fine, and but it'd be nice to kind of modernize the code base a bit. And Johannes and Stephen were on the call. Johannes Baiter and Stephen. Actually, what is Stephen's surname? It's from Digerati. He was on the call. They were on the call, and they can't make it today, unfortunately. But they're okay with me relaying the call, what we talked about. Oh, Stephen Frasier, that's it. So we had a really good discussion. You know, as you may already know, there's some shared code already between UV and Mirador, which is this manifesto library. And there's also this kind of IIIF vocabulary library as well, which kind of is pretty simple list of enums of strings and things that are commonly used. And there's a bunch of other components on there, such as kind of metadata component for displaying all the different types of metadata in a manifest. We've got a tree component, a gallery component, there's an AV component that was used by Europeana on a separate project a while back, where it was kind of not in the context of the UV, but it was a AV player on one of their sites they developed. So that was quite an interesting example of how, you know, reusable components can be powerful. Yeah, so we looked at, we all agreed on the call that, yeah, it could be cool to try and standardize on something like React. We all like React, and we all actually like TypeScript now as well, which is something we can all kind of agree on. And yeah, I'm just checking my notes. Ideally, you know, one of the things that was brought up, could we make these components kind of as sort of headless as possible? So not force any particular state management strategy, you know, Redux, MobX, etc., or any kind of particular styling library, because there's lots of those around. Mirador uses Material UI. I use Tailwind on a lot of stuff. A lot of people use Bootstrap and things like that. And there's also different React UI frameworks out there, such as which are kind of meta frameworks on top of React, such as Chakra, Radix, or Material UI, or various ones like that. So how could we, if we were to make these kind of components, how could we make them in such a way that any of these kind of other component frameworks would kind of interoperate well with them? So we don't want to kind of, you know, tell people which component framework to use outside of that. Yeah, and there's a small experiment that shows that you can use React in web components now using Preact. That I actually put that together with the Preact team a couple of years ago. Stephen tested it, and he says that will work. So well, it could work. So if we wanted to, we could even wrap up the React components in a web component, and then someone using Vue.js or Svelte, or I don't know how well Svelte plays with web components, but you know, potentially we could do that as well. Yeah, so that was it really. We've already got a IIIF Commons channel on the IIIF Slack, so we were thinking like that'd be a good place to kind of talk about these things, and if there were interest from the rest of the community. So yeah. I'll open it to everyone else. Is this something that's interesting to people, or is it kind of?
I do think it's very interesting. I think it's very important, right? It's one of the things IIIF tries to get out there, is that these things can interoperate. For me, I guess, when you're getting in and designing these components, no matter what, when you're designing components, certain things are just, you're making it work for X or Y. So you're making these certain choices that give the certain, I'm just wondering how you keep it open, not only to include React, but like ES 2016 and TypeScript and all of those things. How do we avoid any like personalized strategy in there? That's the biggest problem I come with when we start developing these web components, is that each person that does the web component has something specific, or something specific to them.
One thing I didn't mention, actually, we identified the metadata component as probably, if we were going to try and create a proof of concept, that the metadata component could be a good one to target, as it's kind of got all you need an element of state in there, because as you go through a manifest, the metadata for the ranges and canvases and everything else needs to be updated, and there's kind of internationalization in there, and but it's a relatively simple component, I think, compared to the others. So it could be a good place to start as a kind of proof of concept. But yeah, that's I mean, is it even possible? I mean, the existence of component libraries, I guess, shows that they are useful, right? So, that there are a bunch of different component libraries out there. They all look very similar to me. The React ones, they all basically do the same kind of things. They've all got like list boxes and those kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, I think it's arguable that through their existence, through the number of component libraries already out there, that they must have some utility. It's just, is there sufficient utility for the IIIF community, which is a small one, right? So you could fit everyone in one room, arguably, right? So is it even, I guess there's two ways of looking at that. It's a small community, so there's no point, or it's a small community, so let's pull our efforts and make something that's a bigger community as a result.
Ed, you mentioned the Radix UI,
Yeah.
and I'm a fan of it, particularly because it comes unstyled. And like, if there was some sort of component library that we had that was like as bare bones as possible, I could see like that being like very, very nifty. And I assume that is maybe part of the proposal here. Is it like something like that, or is and the metadata component could be like the starter for this sort of thing?
Yeah, so something that's very unstyled and kind of headless was the word that came up, like, because there's lots of different strategies around styling things, right? I mean, there's I think stitches is what Radix uses, but there's like style components, and there's Tailwind. Tailwind is like a very widely used thing as well. It's quite a different strategy, but is there other ways to, and I think there is a way to use Tailwind with Radix, in fact. I remember seeing something about that on Twitter or something. So yeah, it'd be nice to kind of not lock people in, because everyone's got their own favorite way of using CSS, right? And or the favorite CSS library, if that's the correct term, because like there's Bootstrap or there's Tailwind, or maybe they want to write their own, or all of that. Maybe what's the kind of lowest common denominator thing that we can make that's got enough utility for everyone, and gives them enough freedom for it to be, you know, appealing. And one of the things we talked about, the other thing is state management. So, you know, there's you know, Redux, which, you know, lots of people like, some people don't like. MobX is kind of more of an observable store kind of thing. There's also like Zustand, which is like a newer one, which I quite like. But I actually use Reducer a lot in React components. I tend to try and avoid Redux and try and use the out of the box, use Reducer hook. And that, you know, we thought about that as like, is that the lowest common denominator thing? Like if we need to do simple sort of state management within these components, could we just do it with out of the box stuff that comes bundled with React? Yeah. And then maybe like the application state could be Redux or MobX or Zustand or whatever, but the internal component state could be handled by something simpler, like more lightweight.
Yeah, we've had a little bit of success kind of going that route, especially for some of these components that are going to be exported and reused and stuff, just using like as much of the built-in just like React like context, or just wrapping your component like your own React like providers. And just, I think that's smart though, keeping a focus on like limited dependencies like wherever possible, if these things are going to be like shared around and stuff. I was kind of curious, could you maybe talk a little bit more about like, I mean, in terms of like thinking things that, you know, could be used in a variety of ways? Like, what are your thoughts about like just doing things like this, just like conceptually in just like web components instead of like React or Vue or whatever, like using something like Stencil? Or, I mean, what are your thoughts? How
Right.
evolved do you think that is, or realistic?
So I was a massive fan of Stencil. I really liked it. I used it for bits and pieces in the UV, which that's the kind of thing that, because, you know, I was kind of stuck in this kind of non-JSX world for a long time with the UV, and I really wanted to use it. And then Stencil came about, and I was like, aha, this is perfect, because I can make web components. There's the web standard stuff, and I can use JSX in them for the sort of templating. I absolutely loved it. And then hooks happened, and then it's kind of like, oh, I love that as well. I really want to use React hooks, like use state and use Reducer and all of that. And they weren't going to go down that route with the project. They've got their own kind of pattern for doing it, and I kind of fell out of love, as it were, with Stencil as a result, because I'm doing tons of React everywhere else but in the IIIF world. Every other project I do, I just straight to, you know, React and hooks and stuff. And Stencil, I kind of, you know, lost interest in it. But then out of my own kind of, I guess, bloody mindedness or whatever, I made this thing. I kind of wanted to show the Stencil guys that it's like you could do this. But I don't think they were that keen. But what they originally did was fork Preact to make Stencil. And since Preact has, you know, been updated and it supports hooks and all of that, right? And I made a kind of proof of concept that I called Stencilla, which you know, takes a React component and wraps it in a web component, but it's using Preact instead of React. And yeah, the Preact team kind of really helped me figure that out. So it's totally, you know, thanks to them, really. And yeah, this is the thing that I showed to Stephen, and Stephen seems to think this is could be a good strategy. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there, where you can use all the power of in a reactive kind of JSX. But you can also get the interoperability of wrapping it in a web component. It'd be nice if it was just completely invisible and it just automatically, it was like a build task or something that did it for you, and then you don't even know it's there. It's just an option in the dist folder or something like that. But yeah, Stencil is just a total proof of concept thing. It's not a kind of production thing or anything like that. Just wanted to see if it would work. Yeah, so really, yeah, I'm really behind web components as well. You know, totally. I don't think it has to be. I guess that's the kind of theme of the call, isn't it? To some extent, it's like it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, right? It doesn't have to be React or web components. It can be React and web components. And you know, is that something that could kind of, you know, be something that our community is more about as well, as a kind of how do we all benefit together from kind of pooling our efforts.
If I can interject and perhaps indirectly respond to one of the questions that came up in the chat, I think to some extent what's less important than the technologies we choose, because those are constantly changing, is the sort of boundaries and interfaces we define of what is a useful component, how does a useful component work, because I think that's a lasting design decision that could impact a lot of projects. And, you know, it might get implemented different ways over time and evolve, but the conceptual piece should be relatively stable.
Well, this is one of the things, because when I started working on breaking bits of the UV out 5 years ago, whatever it was, I've had a lot of time to kind of refine these interfaces for, you know, a tree component or a gallery or a metadata component, etc. So I've kind of got, if we were to do this, then I've got some of the way already with like defining what an interface might be for these components, albeit completely abstract from the implementation. But yeah, I think that's a lot of the work, is defining those interfaces, and I think a lot of it, you know, I could probably help with that a bit. But yeah, I mean, what Josh was saying was kind of, you know, there's various kind of AV viewers in development and things like that. You know, could be kind of, could we all be making our lives easier, a bit easier? Well, yeah, you know. Any other thoughts?
Can I ask a higher question of how do you think is the best way to kind of organize this work going forward? We did used to have the kind of the software development group. Is it worth kind of resurrecting that? And is it the type of thing where we'd have monthly meetings discussing, maybe starting with the kind of looking at the interface, and maybe starting with a prototype and then kind of developing components as we go along? How would the best way to work with the community?
Well, I think really would need kind of, before we did anything, we need to kind of establish, is this something people want and are willing to kind of commit to on some level? I mean, I definitely think it's a good idea and would be willing to commit some time to it. But yeah, I think that's the first thing you have to figure out. But we've got the IIIF Commons GitHub repository, and lots of people have access to that. We're all equal kind of owners of that. We've got the IIIF Commons channel on the Slack as well for discussion. So we've got all the kind of stuff we need. to sort of get the ball rolling. I mean, we could do a call if people wanted to do that. But yeah, I think it's just that first thing is to establish, is this something people actually want to see?
I got another question, if it's okay to so when you're talking about UI components, and I guess, or maybe just take a step back. So I'm kind of thinking about this and just some recent work that Matt and I have been doing that maybe he's talked about this in like previous calls that I haven't been on, but so it seems like there's like two things in our recent experience working on a couple things that could be componentized. Like one would be the actual, like the UI elements themselves, like the visual elements that compose an application. And a second potential for like componentizing things would be like a parsing library, or just how do you have like a standard, something like Manifesto, or like that Hyperion framework that Matt kind of like introduced to our team, or just something where, you know, you could still like build independent UIs, but you're just using like a common typed out way of like simplifying like retrieval of like data from manifests and stuff. But back to the UI stuff, like what are you thinking when you're talking about like creating reusable components? Like, is there just like a bucket of UI, like generic components that you have in your mind, or are you thinking about this like universal viewer and just looking at that as like a series of like things to like break out, or what I guess what do you mean by like UI components?
So one of the things we talked about with this was this metadata component. So Johannes was saying that I think there's some stuff that the metadata component in the UV does that it doesn't do in Mirador, right? And also they quite like, by the sounds of it, to use hooks in Mirador. Sort of at the moment it's kind of class-based thing. So there was that was a kind of a shared kind of benefit there for both projects. If we're all working on this, if we at least just make this metadata component and nothing else, that's still useful, right? And it's just kind of just, I guess, starting with one and then seeing if that works for everyone. But yeah, I mean, you know, there's this concept of the kind of exploded viewer, right? That I know Tom's talked about before. It's like, you know, we're currently it feels like we're in this kind of, we're in viewer land, and you know, what if we had this kind of easy way to kind of combine up bits in various ways quickly, then we may see more innovation in the space, and more types of UIs, and you know, different ways of doing things. You know, it's kind of reduces the kind of initial overhead. Yeah, I was just thinking like, trying to think of I mean, like, you know, there's this material UIs like rebranded recently, I think, MUI now, but this is a kind of a nice example of a component library. And obviously, you know, lots of people, you know, if you're a developer and you're kind of like, what is this IIIF stuff? Can I build something quickly just to try it out? Maybe something like this might be a way to kind of hit the ground running. I mean, I know I lean on component libraries heavily for everything else. There's no way I could make like a rich text box, a rich text editor, or drag and droppable list, or, you know, I don't want to maintain. I could probably if given enough time, but I don't want to maintain that. And I guess the other big elephant in the room is the sort of sustainability of having a shared component library, because we've got lots of eyes on it, and hopefully lots of different projects using it. I mean, it takes the burden off any individual developer to keep that going. And you know, that's something I'm keenly familiar with, like the kind of you know, and sustainability for the EV has been a huge thing, and you know, we needed to figure that out, and we've got this open collective now, which kind of helps with that, and that's what kind of paid for the Webpack stuff. And it's working really well. But you know, if there were a component library that the EV really lent on and used heavily, then that open collective money could go into that. And, you know, there's no reason why we couldn't be spending money on something that's got even wider utility for the IIIF community. I'd like to see that happen, you know. It's just, you know, yeah, sustainability, I think at the end of the day, that's the kind of the biggest, that's the big picture. How do you make it so that everyone's got a, you know, skin in the game, as it were, and wants to keep this thing going.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say, getting to that and some discussion we had in the Maps TSG call that was right before this, it's like, I was thinking specifically of annotations or body rendering, but you know, we have cookbook. The cookbook group is pointing out some patterns, like here's how you might do tagging annotations with semantic tags and labels. I'm not sure that all of that renders well in Mirador. You know, we've produced recipes or are producing recipes about tagging geodata, you know, using annotations on it, like tagging an area of a canvas with geo and georeferencing that. Making that work, you know, to have a demo of that would require us to then go into Mirador, you know, because if there was an annotation body rendering component library, the TSG could make the component like as a reference model and contribute it, right? And say, here's, and then immediately have a demo if it was pluggable. Instead of just producing a recipe and saying, well, maybe someone will implement this someday. And then waiting for various viewers to catch up. And I think that would be a more sustainable model, would be to say, okay, if you're going to propose these patterns, well, we have a library and contribute a component. It might not be perfect, but it could at least demonstrate what you're trying to get at, and then the rest of the community can pick it up and see what they want to make that into.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
I think that going that way too in a component library would allow us to like independently version each of these components. And again, that's something that like I think like the Radix UI component library does. I don't know if Material does it, but like where each component within Radix has its own like version. And so, you know, when you're developing button is a thing. And so the metadata could just be a thing and be worked on independently. And same thing for, you know, anything else in there. Ed, in the description, we also mentioned like hooks. I mean, are we also thinking there'll be like a hook library as well, or like maybe like somehow like shifting some of that stuff that's in like Manifesto over to this, where it's like get canvas or whatever, something like very simple, but on like and like an independent hook level.
I think so, yeah. I think that makes sense. I mean, yeah. I mean, Manifesto kind of grew. It's one of those things. It's like I was kind of doing the same thing over and over again. It's like, okay, that's a utility, that's a utility, that's a utility. And then just make all those utilities into a library, and yeah. But you know what it really doesn't matter what, as long as it kind of, you know, paints the right pixels at the end of the day. It doesn't really, you know, and yeah, I mean, I think from the call a couple of weeks ago, we all immediately kind of, it didn't take much time at all for us all to agree that React and hooks are a great, because we all use it, and you know, it's a be a good pattern, at least for us, to standardize on. And yeah, I don't, you know, I think the hooks-based approach is appealing. Like you use Canvas or, you know, what have you. I mean, yeah. So the metadata component I've got at the moment on IIIF Commons, it's got, I kind of modeled, I started playing around with Svelte when that came out years ago. And when I made these components, I kind of modeled it on how that works at the time, where you had like a set method and you passed in a kind of an object, and that was all your data for the component. And then it had events that you could respond to. So yeah, I've got a kind of a pretty well-defined kind of data object that something like a metadata component needs. And if we could kind of figure out a way to, you know, to get all of that data using a kind of a hooks-based approach, then it should just, you know, there's a lot of kind of rewriting of logic needed around all the kind of rendering of stuff, but I don't think it's too onerous. And we could end up with a single kind of example, and sort of work out from there. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of kind of like making these, like putting them to the test, I could probably kind of ask for money from the steering group to replace the metadata component and see if it works in the UV, and then, you know, maybe the Mirador team could find a way to, you know, try it in Mirador as well, and then we'd have kind of level 0 of like first example of a kind of shared component in two major sort of viewers. I think once these things start to exist, I think it will change the kind of dynamic a bit, where things might free things up a bit more, where, you know, the more experimentation can happen, things can be made quicker.
So kind of curious, has there ever been anything like, and again, I haven't like followed this community like super close over the past couple of years, but has there ever been anything like personas, like even like developer personas or like team persona, of like how people might want to use like some of these reusable pieces instead of just like randomly, you know, just like, hey, this could be cool, or that's, you know, like if there was, if you kind of like struck or viewed it through that lens, there's something, and like, or I'm just thinking for like our team, we could like take something like that and be like, hey, for us, it would be super helpful if we could take like these particular pieces or whatever. And it might also be helpful to like, if people were going to be working on something like this over the next year or two, if there's like a central place where they could like see things through like other people's eyes too. And, you know, as they're developing something maybe locally, like, oh, other people are kind of interested in this too.
When you say developer personas, do you mean like kind of tech stacks, or do you mean the kinds of applications people are building for different audiences?
No, I was kind of thinking like, or personas like say you're doing, I don't know, like you're developing a new feature and you're like, hey, my name is Jane and I'm a, you know, project manager, and here's how I would want to use this particular feature of I would think. So maybe like one persona could be like, hey, my name's Adam and I'm a React developer and we're working on a, I don't know, an image viewer that could make benefit of, yeah, like a certain, like a thumbnail gallery at the bottom of the board. I guess that might like cross into like technical kind of stuff. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about if there's like some way to kind of, yeah, maybe like consolidate like some of these different ideas for like what a component library like could be, or identify like what would be some of the most beneficial like pieces. I think that's a great approach, like to take, or just to me, it seems like a really good approach to take like something like a metadata component or something that's like small and simple, and you start with something like that. And at the same time, like also to have like a little mini like component library, say it just starts out with like 1 or 2 or 3, or just like something visual that like developers and non-developers can like look at and see, and you know, just start to wrap their heads around.
One thing I really like is Code Sandbox. I really love demos on there and putting demos together. I've been doing that with UV a lot recently. It's just so much easier than kind of writing documentation, or you know, you just quickly whip together a demo and send it to someone. And I find that really powerful. There's a kind of, you know, way of demonstrating things and a way of quickly trying things out. And I think if we made them in such a way that they're very code sandboxable, that would be powerful.
Here's an idea. We could kind of do like a synoptic survey of viewers in the widest possible sense. So like, here's UV, here's Mirador, here's Tiffy, here's viewer X, here's viewer Y, but also here are other kind of viewing experiences that people produce for IIIF. And then like, okay, if you look at all of those things and start drawing boxes around the things you think might be a component, what's the kind of commonality there? Well, there's a metadata component in all these things, or there's a thumbnail strip, or there's a, you know,
Yeah.
like that kind of, okay, right, well, if you shake all that up, what boxes fall out?
There's also the like structure, you know, that alone is like an extremely complicated thing. And if imagine you're starting from scratch, you know, like I'm going to build a new IIIF viewer. It's like it's like someone trying to, it's not as complicated, but it's like I'm going to build a new browser. It's like, do you know what I mean? It's like, it's incredibly difficult, sophisticated thing. And you know, it's kind of, you end up only having kind of Google making it, because you know, it kind of feels like the situation we're in at the moment a little bit, or we're in danger of getting into, whereas it's just exceedingly hard to make a viewer.
Well, I'd say it's exceedingly hard to make a general purpose viewer.
General purpose, yeah. Well, yeah, like just the structure, the ranges, and dealing with ranges alone is, yeah, really difficult. You know, thumbnails are incredibly complicated when you really get down to it. It's all complicated, and yeah, a thumbnail strip would be an amazing one. Really, really good. I mean, if you think about it as well, OpenSeaDragon is like a component, right? That's taking a ton of difficult work off us, and we're all benefiting from that. So it's like, I guess it's sort of the same thing as that, isn't it? It's the same. It's like, you know, further modularizing things.
Just thinking on the persona question. So we do have personas for kind of the higher level, how people use IIIF, but we haven't really done the developer side of it. One thing we do have in other communities is user stories. And I wonder whether that's a way of gathering kind of components that people want and trying to kind of figure out which are going to be the most popular. I know the thumbnail one, I'm forever writing code to parse thumbnails. So I don't know whether we should start on IIIF Commons kind of a stories repo to try and find out, what people are developing a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if I guess if a new project came along where they wanted to build a new kind of viewing experience, and then we could use that as the kind of test case, couldn't we? If someone gets a grant and they're like, right, we're going to build another viewing experience, IIIF viewing experience, and then we make it known that we're up for collaborating with those people to try and see if we can do it in a more generic kind of way. I think if it were me, I'd probably jump at that, having help from the whole IIIF community behind me on that front. But yeah, user stories repository is probably a good idea, I think.
Given that we're in our last 10 minutes and things seem to be quieting down, should we try to pin down some next steps that we actually want to try to move forward with? I certainly think within the UV community, there is strong interest in doing the metadata component conversion, but do we need to come up with a mechanism, for example, to get people from other communities in on code reviews or conversations? There's the talk about the user stories. Do we need a repository to collect them? And I see that Robert has his hand up, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to take it in a slightly different direction at the end, because yeah, I'm not so much into the front ends, at least I try to keep that out. So I think it's good if people collaborate more in that area, certainly, but I'm not practically in it. But I was just thinking about, because we're also building other more low-level tools, I'm just thinking about the work on the new Prezi 3 Python library for server-side stuff, which is also meant at something that at least in the past existed for version 2 and people used in different projects. And I was wondering, because I thought IIIF Commons, maybe we should all get all the projects together, but because the IIIF Commons is more about the front-end side of things, I was also thinking that I think at least what I heard these days on GitHub, you can have these kinds of tags or stuff to at least one of the things I was thinking about was I never came across IIIF Commons when just browsing GitHub. And I guess it would be nice to have some way so that there would be one place to find all the IIIF related stuff, other than going to some awesome list. I mean, awesome lists are awesome, yeah, but maybe something more, if not putting everything in one basket, which may not be practical, then at least having some other way of, so that also a programmer that thinks I'm writing a new IIIF parsing library, that then once they go to GitHub, they find out, oh, there is already a dozen of them, or there's this one that everybody else uses, something along those lines.
What I guess does the IIIF Awesome list kind of capture most of the Google traffic? I mean, maybe we could link to the Commons from there. That's kind of a good vector, as it were. think we do link to the IIIF Commons from there, in fact. So we've got manifesto on there and things like that. One component, the tree component. So yeah, I mean, at the same time, I guess we've got to be careful. We don't try and we don't appear to be favoring IIIF Commons over anything else. But, you know, is it, I guess, at the end of the day, is this a useful shared place to develop stuff? And does it help with sustainability for all of us? You know, is there actual utility in this or not? I guess that's the big question. I think there probably is. Like I say, I use component libraries all the time for different domains of, you know, where they make sense. And yeah, I think if there were a IIIF component collection, I would definitely use it. Especially if it's kind of got that kind of, oh, this is kind of backed by the community. That always inspires a lot of kind of confidence in things. You know, that it's sustainable. I mean, I've heard that a few times in the last couple of years. You know, it's not actually features as much anymore. People tell me I'm wrong, sure, but I've heard people say, you know, I care more about sustainability than features to some extent. It's like, is this thing going to be around? Because I've been bitten by this so many times, like using some flashy new bit of technology, and it's just the guy or the individual who's maintaining it stops maintaining it, like hooks libraries already, right? It's like you think, oh yeah, I'll use this React use, yeah, and it's not maintained anymore. And it's like, it's because there's one person working on it and there's no community behind it. So it's very risky. And are we de-risking IIIF development by creating something like this?
I think so too. I know I would, and I think Adam would be too, like heavily use this, especially if it mapped to the spec as much as it could. You know, whatever the big titles are in the spec, anything that you can hyperlink to, we should probably have a component for or something. Like, you know, what is a label? What is metadata? What is rights? You know, like, and like, I could just see it, that creating sort of a self-sustaining mechanism for it, because be immensely useful, whether or not you're in a viewer or not.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think there's, you know, given the folks on this call, I think there's a lot of interest in this. I haven't heard, no one's objected. So I think partly it's just figuring out the right way to proceed. And to Damian's question, I think, you know, maybe it's just using that IIIF Commons channel to potentially organize, you know, a first effort. I will lightly volunteer us and mostly Glenn, to be honest. We're already going to get in touch with some of the viewer developers about the viewer matrix related to the cookbook recipes. And I think we could probably informally add in something about this, you know, just if there were like a bullet point list of some of these things, you know, not a full survey like Tom was suggesting, but at least a start. So I think we can definitely do that. And yeah, I don't want to keep people over here, but I guess just to say, like, I think there's a lot of utility in this. Obviously, I think this is, you know, a really great point of maturity for the IIIF community and the developer community. So I would say that Slack channel, the IIIF Commons, and or the technical channel on the Slack would be a great place to stay tuned on this. And then maybe we, you know, see how the metadata component goes, and anything else to sort of lodge, you know, as we stay tuned on this for the beginning of 2022.
Cool. If anyone wants to like arrange a call or something in the new year where we kind of talk about this a bit more, just specifically this metadata component, then go ahead. Like, you know, maybe use the IIIF Commons channel, maybe, and just sort of get talking on there.
I think it's perfect. Well, yeah, I don't want to keep people over, so I'll just say thanks to everybody. I think this has been really useful. I think this is potentially the beginning of a really useful project endeavor. Ed and Demian, thanks for getting it started a couple weeks ago and bringing this to the broader group. Yeah, and thanks all for your interest. We'll see you on the Slack channel and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.